And we are back on the Awkward Sports Podcast, Go T and all. That's Josh. I'm Harrison. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have paid Mike Evans 2 years, $52 million, $35 million guaranteed. Sets the stage for him to be a Buck for life. We'll get to the rest of the Bucks transactions in a moment. But first, let's talk the man. 10 years, 1,000 yards minimum per season. I saw someone call him Mr. Buccaneer on Twitter. I don't know if I go that far yet, but it's starting to become fitting for sure.
Yeah, I mean, hey, in this day and age, when you play 10 years for a franchise and then you sign another 2-year extension, which means odds are he's going to be a Buccaneer for 12 seasons. I think in this day and age, that's good enough to cement yourself as somebody like that. But, I went down memory lane today. I went back and watched and I don't really do this like with athletes, but I went back and watched like Mike Evans's introductory press conference. Their social media went on Twitter and posted like a little snippet of it, but I went back and like watched the whole thing, and I thought it was kind of funny to see how some of the things like unfolded after the fact. Like he talked about his hamstring in that introductory product in that introductory press conference, and I kind of laughed and like that thing's never healed, but he's always given us 1,000 yards every year. Um, but no, it was the right decision. And honestly, it might have even been the best decision if you look at the way this contract kind of worked out for the Buccaneers. You look at a 2-year deal, it's front loaded most of the money this year, but in a way where like he's not going to be a major cap hit. So that is huge. Plus it's 2 years, so you don't feel trapped. And you can kind of reevaluate in 2 years again, what he might be, what he might deserve or might be worth at that point when he's due for another contract. So you look at that deal, they got it done. They didn't mess around before and let this thing get to the free agent period. And that was to me like the ultimate thing that they should have done. They almost lost him, I felt like at times throughout the course of the last 365 days, but ultimately they got it done, and I couldn't be happier.
I think most Bucks fans are in your boat that they are very happy with it. Yes, when you think about it, you think 26 per year, it's a lot for a wide receiver, but then you remember not all of it's guaranteed, which I think helps. And in the end, you can't think about it just from the cap perspective or the stats perspective. Like we all agree, it's just from a perspective that the greatest offensive player in the team's history is staying with the team. He could have gone been with Patrick Mahomes. He could have gone to Houston, partnered up with CJ Stroud. I don't know if he gets as much money, but he certainly would have been in a better playoff scenario, even with the Texans, I feel, just because they're on the up and up now, or just for the fact that if you're with the Chiefs, they'll get the chance to be part of a three-peat. I thought that would have been a major selling point that would have sent him to Kansas City personally, just because we talked about this on the last episode. Who else do the Chiefs have really besides Travis Kelce? The answer is maybe Pacheco as a
Maybe Rasheed Rice kind of came along as a rookie this
maybe.
past year. Yeah, but to your point, yeah, I think there were other destinations that were more attractive for Mike Evans this offseason. And with the salary cap going up for every NFL team, I think he actually could have gotten the money that he ended up getting here in Tampa with some of those teams. Like I think Kansas City, that 2-year deal, that would have been a very friendly deal for Kansas City. I think Kansas City would have paid him that money that Tampa Bay just handed him. I heard a rumor that Houston wasn't interested in pursuing Mike Evans. There's two sides to this that I think where it's like, I mean, yeah, initially you'd be like, what? What are you talking about? But you also have to remember, at least for the Texans, they have like, again, like last season, coming into this past season, they were one of the worst teams in the league. They have all this money. It's a deep wide receiver class. And they can also, because they have all this cap space, you could take on a guy like Mike Evans, and it would make some sense to have some veteran leadership. But also, it's like you are like in the early stages of a rebuild. A 33 year
Coming out
old
of a rebuild.
receiver, a 31-year-old receiver you know, is maybe not the best for that kind of price too. So I can see it both ways. I can see it both ways, him being a fit there and him not. But ultimately, it's just great that he's going to be wearing the same uniform again, at least for another 2 seasons. And it's just, I mean, and you touched on it, the best offensive player in Buccaneer history. I think when it's all said and done, I think he could be the best player in Buccaneer history. See how long he can keep doing this.
And you also have to think of this, and I'm just remembering to bring up a quote that was tweeted by Greg Allman when the deal was done. It almost feels like, if maybe from Evan's perspective and maybe everyone's perspective, that if this deal doesn't get done, somebody's going to regret that it didn't get done. Because Mike Evans went to his agent and said, I want to be a Buccaneer for life. I'm paraphrasing. I don't have the actual quote in front of me, but that's what happened. And the deal got done. Sometimes that's what it takes. You have that real, and again, I'm more speculating what might be going on in the minds of people because there's no quote that says anywhere, oh, I knew if I didn't do this deal, I'd regret it. I'm just kind of taking the idea that, he probably realizes when he is in Tampa Bay, he's the guy. You go somewhere else, you're no longer the guy. Yeah, you're still going to be a big name and everyone's going to be hyped to have you, but you're no longer the face of a franchise if you depart. You have
Yeah,
to
and
rebuild your relationships with a new community. He does a lot in the Tampa Bay. Look, there's a reason why he's been a nominee for the Walter Payton Man of the Year. All that. You just get to continue all your relationships, continue to be the face of a franchise. Everyone, you are beloved here in Tampa Bay. There's no reason to move on when you think of it that way. And again, I do not have a quote that says any of this. I am simply speculating, but I have to imagine if you go out of your way to tell your agent, let's get this done, that has to be the mindset, I imagine.
yeah, and I think that and we talk about like paraphrasing what behind the scenes what we think went on. Another thing though that this contract kind of told me, and from the business perspective, it was a smart decision, for a 2-year deal. But from the buck for life discussion, I think that Evans has got more. Like he's got more than 2 football playing years left in him. I could be
Oh
wrong.
yeah.
He might be like, hey, I got my money. I'm ready to retire, and that would be all right too. But like it kind of the 2-year thing kind of told me that maybe that ownership wasn't really prepared. Because the last offseason they couldn't come to an agreement. They weren't really sure, and now they kind of realized that oh maybe we messed this thing up, which many people would have said back then. They would have given them the money, and I think in this situation with all the contracts that were coming up, I think a 4 or 5 year deal just the ownership wasn't really prepared for that this offseason because you heard the rumors of like the Bucks are looking to bring back Evans, quote unquote, in a big way. 2 years doesn't strike to me as a big long term deal. It's like, an extension maybe where they can figure that final contract out down the road.
I
Um,
agree.
but again, regardless, because of everything that the Bucks front office has to juggle this offseason, getting the Evans deal done, or at least pushing it, like at least getting a Evans deal done and pushing something like that down the road where maybe it can make more sense was the best thing for them. And I think we talked about this on one of our previous episodes. Like, what are the Bucks doing? The possibility of letting Mike Evans walk, or you know going and paying Baker 5 years or whatever, which could happen here today or in the coming days or for a lengthy extension. Um, I think this was a good first step in this offseason, and it'll be interesting to see what they do next.
Yeah, and you mentioned the idea of like setting up for a later deal. I think that's probably also why it was 2 years. I'm going to agree on you with that 100%. Because you have a situation where the Bucks really don't know what the future entails yet. They're coming off a big few years with Tom Brady, where they really messed up their salary cap situation. Give it 2 years, see how much the cap goes up in that time, see how the roster looks at that point, and see how you can structure a longer term deal. It definitely buys them, and I mean almost in the literal and figurative sense, before I forget how to speak English, the time to get it all figured out. So they got priority one out of the way. Mike Evans is signed. I guess they're halfway, I would say, to getting priority two done. And that is figuring out Antoine Winfield Jr., their prized all pro safety long term. They just franchise tagged him today. They did it before the deadline. They don't necessarily have to keep the tag on him. They can figure out some kind of other deal by July. That stuff happens more than you think. But they need to make sure that they have at least secured Winfield for one more year as they figure stuff out. But that also leads to the question of what do they do with Baker Mayfield? Because he's going to be a free agent in a week from the publishing of this episode. They could have, in a perfect world, you figure out the long-term deal with Winfield, and then you just franchise tag Baker Mayfield.
That
That
would have
would have
been
been
the ideal.
perfect. Which for some reason, we've never talked about that scenario. What if tag Baker on this episode? I literally
Well, they can't.
thought.
Well, I don't think they can now. And I think it's because maybe they could transition tag him, I think, because I think you're only allowed to use, for his franchise tag, you're only allowed to use the franchise tag on one player.
Well, I
For a
meant
season.
instead
Yeah,
of Winfield, you get him the long term deal, then you tag Baker, is what I meant.
right. Yeah, and I think that might have been what they had done had they gotten the Winfield deal done, in the past like 36 to 48 hours, because the deadline to use the tag was today at 4 p.m. So a little over an hour ago. But it was one of those things where I think that would have been the ideal situation, right? You give Antoine Winfield the 4 or 5 year deal, you extend Mike Evans until you figure out what you can do with him to make him a buck for life when maybe it's more of an appropriate time. And then, you franchise tag Baker Mayfield, which isn't the worst thing in the world, because then again, you're not trapped. If, let's just say, things go really sideways this year for Tampa, I've looked at their schedule, look at their matchups. They got a really, really tough schedule. And that's what happens when you win the division. Things can go a different direction this year than maybe they did last year with a new offensive coordinator who isn't Dave Canales. It's Liam Cohen, and he may be better, he may be worse. That'll be something we'll find out here this upcoming season. But in case things do go sideways, then at least you're not trapped, and it's like, oh, we have Baker on the books now for 2 more years, and we now know that he's not the guy in this scenario. Like the New York Giants are currently stewing with Daniel Jones. Like buyers, like there was reports that have been coming out per some of these top sources that were saying the Giants have buyer's remorse on Daniel Jones on the contract that they just gave him. So, yeah, I think that would have been a very ideal situation for Tampa, franchise tagging Baker, extending Antoine Winfield for the long term. But at least right now, Tampa is in a position with the tag on Winfield Jr. and the extension of Mike Evans. They're not going to be in the worst case scenario coming away from this offseason. I like how it's shaping up so far.
Yeah. No, I think certain things are looking pretty good. The problem with Baker still is how much do you give him per year? Because we talk about the Daniel Jones contract and some of these other contracts recently that haven't gone anybody's way. I know I'm really shooting to a very different scenario, but Russell Wilson just got cut by the Broncos. With the inflated quarterback contracts, look, Baker just got $8 million last year. He might be in for a pay raise of like $20 million plus. And I'm talking about on top of the eight. I'm not saying 20 million plus total. I mean 8 million plus 20 something. And because of how the quarterback market's gone the last few years, that's what he would get. Do the Bucks want to roll the dice knowing they could get stuck with a ton of dead cap? Because even let's say if not all 30 million for a year is guaranteed, I have to imagine at least more than 20 is going to be. He's not going to agree to a deal if it's not, because he can go somewhere else and probably get more guaranteed money up front.
And that it's interesting that you brought that up. You can go somewhere else and get more guaranteed money up front. would it possibly be the worst thing in the world if somebody else overpays for Baker Mayfield? Like if
Oh, I
somebody
don't think it would be the worst thing in the world at all. I'm just talking
where
about
it's
what do you
like
do if you're the Bucks?
where it's like, okay, we were gonna offer Baker this, and like somebody literally came by and like gave him a New York Giants shocking size offer, like because there are teams that are looking for a quarterback. What if the Raiders are like, we're a little bit lower on the draft board here. We may not be able to trade up and get one of these guys that we want. Baker had a good year. We like what we see in him. Why don't we go out and pay him the boatload of money to where Tampa, since they've already used the franchise tag on Antoine Winfield, can't really match the deal or keep him and kind of make a pitch to him. Hey, you can come back. You're gonna have to come back for less money. Maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world.
No. I mean, look, in the end, if someone really comes and hands Baker a massive deal, and I think the deal's not going to come until after he is officially an unrestricted free agent too. I just don't see a scenario where they get a deal figured out in the next week. They need more time even just to talk about it. But if someone comes and tells Baker, here's a big 5-year deal, I think if you're the Bucks, you have to just say bye.
You just
You
have
know,
to,
either
and I know it's tough. And again, it's also something though that like it's tricky too because it's like we talk about trying to go behind the scenes of the Mike Evans deal. What was said in those rooms? What was kind of like not really the selling point. That's not really the right phrase, but what was kind of like the tipping point that said, okay, I'll take this for 2 years and maybe not a longer term deal. Maybe they said something about, hey, we're doing this. We're gonna bring back Baker for you. Maybe Mike Evans wants to play with Baker Mayfield here, and maybe part of the reason why Evans came to that agreement that he did was contingent upon Baker Mayfield returning as the Buccaneers starter. Maybe he feels the same way about keeping Baker as Baker wanted to keep Mike Evans as a package deal. Maybe there's something there as well. So I mean, obviously, we weren't behind those doors. We have no idea of knowing, but honestly, the latest I've heard on the Baker Mayfield thing is that a deal could be done here in the coming days before like free agency opens up. I know Tampa's motivated to try to do that. So I could see it happening here in the next few days. Not even really a week per se, but like again, there's a lot of moving parts to this. And again, Tampa's one of those teams this offseason that they have a lot of decisions they have to make with a lot of key players on past teams.
no, they definitely do. But actually, let's think about this for a moment because I just have Tankathon up. Let's say they choose to just move on from Baker. Someone hands them a deal, or maybe they just can't figure something out in the next week where both parties are happy. Baker thinks, well, even though I got to figure out the OC situation with them, I just want to move on. What might encourage the Bucks too to make something happen, you mentioned like the Raiders, is just the fact that the Bucks have the 26th overall pick. Pretty much all the first round guys are gonna be gone.
Gone, man. I do before I segue to the draft here. I wanted to bring this up because I found this. This is from obviously on someone on social media that's very well known. Um, the Bucks are trying to re-sign Baker Mayfield. This was a March 4th, so this was yesterday morning. Uh, but there are apparently sources that say that the QB will not take a quote unquote hometown discount. Meanwhile, teams like Atlanta and Minnesota are watching. Now, what I've heard is in terms of this, I've heard the rumors that I've heard as far as Atlanta is that they're probably going to end up with Kirk Cousins. That's what I've been hearing today. But that means Minnesota. That means one of those teams isn't getting that. And Minnesota may come by, and that could be a suitable team there as well. So, like, if Baker Mayfield's not willing to take a hometown discount, hey, I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe these stars align in a way that it just works out because we can sit here and act like Baker Mayfield is a long-term fix at quarterback, but as much as I like him, as much as I like the season that he had, I don't know if he's a long-term fix. I think he is a. I think he had a nice season under Canales. I think under Liam Cohen, if he came back, I think he'd have another pretty good year. But I don't know. I mean, I just don't know if he's like that type of franchise altering guy that doesn't need that can do it with less is I guess what I'm saying.
Well, I can't say if he can do it with less. All I know is before the Bucks, he had at least proven that on the Browns he could win a playoff game.
Yep. And that Browns team was really good though, too, mind you.
They
That team
were.
that was a really good team. But like, yeah, it'll be interesting. It's interesting to see how like news continues to break because this is a very busy time for the NFL as like free agency is going to start in like a week. So all these teams are trying to like make these decisions before they have to compete with other teams and like it'll be really interesting to see like how that all unfolds. But you were talking about the draft, right? We were talking about that. You were talking about how yeah, the Bucks are picking 26th. I've seen some mocks I've seen the most common name that I've seen for Tampa is an edge from Penn State, which hey, keep drafting those defensive players, man. I mean, they
They're
just keep
hitting on the defensive players. Anytime
well,
the Bucks see someone they want, I will trust them to make the moves, especially with how they worked out last year too. Or really
yeah,
just the last few years, just going back to like 2020.
yeah, and I mean, yeah, and it's like depending on the year, it's like hit or miss, I'd say. But like, yeah, because they're taking so many of these guys, they've really been building this defense. Like the year that they took Joe Tryon, Diaby's already come in after that and kind of taken that spot. So they hit on Diaby. Not sure about Tryon. They hit on. It looks like they hit on Cansey. I don't know if they hit on Logan Hall, but like they're drafting a boatload of these guys up
Well, they
front.
hit on Winfield.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. That was. I mean, that draft across the board was just
That was
stellar.
just a hit
I
after
mean,
hit.
it was weird because it was like I
I
rarely
would say probably with the exception of like Tyler Johnson, but that was about it for 2020.
Yeah, and I mean, I rarely, and he wasn't even that bad. He was just buried on a depth chart. Like, if you're taking him as a fourth rounder, like, not every fourth round pick's going to be a wide receiver one. He was like wide receiver four on that team. So, like, he wasn't like, I wouldn't, like, in terms of where he was drafted, he wasn't a bust because he was a fourth round pick. Like, how much do you expect out of a fourth round player? He may not have been like a steal or he may not have been like a surprise, but I wouldn't even say he was a bust. But like you look at that draft, it's very rare that I get super excited with like who a team picks on draft night. I think it's only happened like three times. Because like one, I probably don't know who the player is because I haven't watched enough of like that conference play, or two, or two, maybe I just don't like the pick and I could be right or wrong. The times I would say I was excited was when they took Worst, they took Winfield. It was like when they took Winfield, it was funny. I was sitting in the living room with my dad watching the draft, and I was like, the Bucks need to take Winfield here, and like it actually happened. It was like the weirdest thing ever, and I was like, now we're going. And then of course the Mike Evans pick. It was like I remember him playing at A&M and I didn't even know his first name at the time, and I just remembered 13 A&M. He's huge. I'm like, who's gonna tackle this guy? And like, if somebody's gonna cover him, like, who's gonna bring him to the ground? And like, when we drafted him, I was like, wait a minute, we got this guy. Like, we took like, I'm like, I think we got the best receiver in the draft.
Yeah,
So like,
you think you get the Johnny Manziel wide receiver. That can't be too bad.
yeah, and it was like, because that's why I tuned into A&M because it was like, you got to watch Johnny football. You got to watch him do this. And like when I was watching those games, Johnny, he was great, but like Evans was the one that stood out to me in those games. I was like, who is this guy that he's throwing it to? He's always throwing it to 13. I'm like, you can't cover this dude. And then I forgot about him because it was the off season, and then we drafted him, and I was like, wait a minute, we got that. I was like, I was so over the moon, but again, yeah, and then I mean, you look at the on 2018 draft. I think they took Vita Vea in the first round. That year, I was like, we need a safety. We got Vita Vea. I'm like, who is this guy? Washington defensive tackle. Well, he turned out to be pretty good. So, it's yeah. I see the mocks. I think I see like a Penn State edge, Chop Johnson or something, or Chop Howard. I don't know. Like his nickname is Chop, and I'm like, hey, I keep the defensive players coming. It seems to be working. So
Look, like we said, just keep doing it. It works for me. Now, I know free agency is coming up, and I'm going to have to decline that. And apologies for the crowd. I received a phone call and I had to hit decline. And I'm almost willing to say on this episode right now, Josh, I want to dare you to match my facial hair.
Oh nope, that's not happening. That will never happen. Um,
I think it would look
but I
great.
appreciate the effort in trying to get me to do
I think it would look great.
that.
I can
Oh
picture
man,
it now, just like the thick
man, you
stash. What was that? You kind of,
know what would be great right now? I'll tell you what would be great. If we could get some breaking news up in here because we got a lot going on. Speaking of a lot going on though in sports, there were a few things I wanted to touch on. We had like Caitlin Clark break Pete Maravich's scoring record in just college basketball. I think that was pretty stellar because, yes, I know Pete Maravich didn't, play as many games, but like where Caitlin Clark shoots the ball from, it's absolutely ridiculous. So that was a huge moment I felt like in sports. She's going to be the number one pick in the WNBA draft. She did decide that she's going to the draft this season. So good for the Indiana Fever. They're going to have the number one pick, so they're going to get her. And then another scoring milestone, LeBron James, 40,000 points. That is unheard of. I guess
unprecedented. No one else has ever hit 40,000 points in their career.
it's just crazy. It's like he hit 40,000 and it wasn't like when Kobe had his final game as a Laker and he scored 60 points and that was a great moment for everybody and that was like such a feel good basketball moment for any fan and they were able to come back and win that game. Like he was like we knew though at that point like his career was kind of done. Like he had like nothing left in the tank. Like it was like LeBron hit 40K. It's like he could play another 3 years. Like that's just absurd to me. That's absolutely ridiculous. Like I didn't know if anybody was going to go after Kareem's record. I didn't know if anyone was going to be able to get there. Well, LeBron's not only passed, he passed that last year, and now he's over 40K, and it's just ridiculous. 40,000 points. He's got more than 10,000 rebounds, and he's got more than 10,000 assists. That is just ridiculous. And I mean, no, from a statistical, from a stats standpoint, I don't know if there's going to be a more accomplished player in a statistical standpoint ever than LeBron. We're watching greatness.
I had this thought earlier today, and I just kind of want to bring in like a hockey comparison because it is a sport that had a goat and then got a new goat a few decades later.
We'll never get another goat ever.
Well, yes, but that's beside my point. Could you say something around the lines of maybe LeBron James is Wayne Gretzky and Michael Jordan is Gordie Howe?
Oh man,
Where some people still think one is still the GOAT, but the narrative is still shifted towards the other. I mean, I don't think it's obviously not the same consensus like it is for Gretzky in the NHL. Whereas I would not even say it's remotely close to a consensus that LeBron's the greatest. But do you think that could be how future people view the two?
it's hard to say at least right now, just because LeBron hasn't retired yet. I think what's tricky about it is like how big of an icon MJ was. I think that like obviously people forget how dominant his air like he played in like his career. Like it didn't obviously span as long as LeBron's did, but he won 6 championships in 8 years. And the only reason really why he didn't go for 7 or 8 is because he stepped away to play baseball. Obviously, we don't know all the details to that story. He's given certain reasons why. We've speculated other reasons why. But like that run of dominance is unheard. LeBron is still working for number 5. Jordan got 6 in an 8-year span, which is again in an era that I mean, there was like the Utah Jazz for Karl Malone. I mean, he scored. He's number 2 on the all time. He was number 2 on the all time scoring list. Now he's number 3 on the all time scoring list. He scored more than Kobe Bryant. I mean, Utah was a team that nobody really thought was going to be unseated because of how well they facilitated an offense, but they were also kind of ahead of their time. So I think it's tricky because also LeBron, all the different teams he played on. I know Wayne Gretzky played for a number of teams as well. whereas Jordan kind of played for like yes, he finished his career with the Wizards. He came back and played a few more years, but like he's mainly remembered as a Bull. I think that's I don't know if that's going to be the comparison, but hey, who
I
knows?
mean,
And
let me add this in. Gordie Howe is primarily a Red Wing, but then he came back and played a few years with the Whalers.
yeah, I mean, hey, who knows? Down the road, that might be one that I could see more of for sure. Obviously, when it comes to hockey, you followed a lot of these players a lot more than I have, so like it's hard for me to either confirm. I know some of these names and I know like some of the legends of the game, but you obviously know what they've been able to do on certain teams and what they've been able to accomplish even more so, and have a greater appreciation of that as well.
And I just want to touch up on like the dominance of Michael Jordan for a moment that I'm just considering now. And I almost feel like the era might also require some context as well. And it's something that I feel like is also missed on LeBron, not to any fault of his own, but just because it's so much more narrow casted. Not everyone views the same things, knows the same people like they used to. Go back to the 90s and think about just how dominant. Like again, we missed this era. We were born after Jordan retired. But just the dominance he had in the consciousness of the world, especially like, North American culture. And, Gretzky got to be part of that too in the 80s and 90s. Just these aren't the same. Like, obviously, LeBron, I would say most people who don't know sports definitely still know who he is. And that's a testament to how huge he is. But then there's the Michael Jordans of the world, where he was just on another level, and to a level I don't think anyone will ever get to be again, at no fault of their own, just because of how the media landscape has changed.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, and like, yeah, he retired. Yeah, the second time he retired, it was before we were born, and then he retired three times. Yeah, I mean, like, it's tough. Like, we do eras in like any sport. Like, one thing that I always try to do in terms of like when I compare my players or whatever, the biggest thing I try to keep separate is definitely eras, just because of like I mean, a player plays in an era, they play in an era. It's like the game has also changed so much, and like a lot, like a lot of sports have, right? You look at basketball and how much that game's changed. I mean, the All Star game, for crying out loud, there was a team that hit 200 points, and the scoreboard didn't go that high. Like even back then, they were competing in the All Star game. So it's just different eras. You can if you start doing the like players in one era and players in another. Obviously, players in today's game, you look at how top to bottom talented, especially the NBA is. And that's kind of the goal, right? That's kind of the goal of like any sport, right? You spread awareness of the sport. People pick up on it in other countries and in other states and other cities, and it becomes a better game, and more people want to play it. So like, it's a good thing that it shows how good the game's evolved. But yeah, it's always tricky, when you talk about greatest of all time, because obviously everyone's going to have their opinion on who's the greatest player of all time in any sport, and it really comes down to just like what you appreciate, and that's kind of how I factor in like who I think's my greatest player as opposed to who maybe is in my top five. So again, you can factor in eras. I choose not to, but again, I think the best part about it is they all bring their own unique attributes to the table that we can all appreciate.
I agree. And we hope everyone has appreciated this episode of the Awkward Sports Podcast. I'm Harrison. That's Josh. More football talk when we get back next time. Until then, we love you all, and we'll see you then, Josh.